Hello, I'm Joe Folger, one of the co-founders of the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. For over 10 years, the Institute has sponsored work that's extended the transformative model of mediation to work in dialogue in political and public policy conflicts as well as ethno-political conflicts. And the two people we have here today, Erik Cleven and Judith Saul, have led the efforts of working with this model in the public dialogue arena in ethno-political conflicts. Today they're going to talk with us about this work and its impact. Welcome to Judy and Erik.
Thanks.
You. So perhaps we could start by talking a little bit about how your prior experience with working in public dialogue and ethno-political conflicts sort of led you to thinking about an alternative way of doing dialogue processes that's now called transformative dialogue. What were the dissatisfactions or what were the issues that you felt needed to be addressed?
Well, I've worked for many years in different post-conflict settings in the former Yugoslavia and in the former Soviet Union and a little bit in Africa. And what I was really doing was what is still referred to as peace building. And the idea being that a third party or an organization from outside comes in and tries to contribute to activities that build peace. And that meant trying to engage people in the things that I thought were important for those societies in order to achieve peace and reconciliation, to give training to people so they could go into other communities and hopefully propagate more activities that would lead to peace. But what I found was that in spite of all kinds of efforts to do this, it really didn't lead to the kinds of changes that I was hoping for. I found that as long as people were employed in a project or were connected to an NGO, they would be involved in activities, but it didn't really ever take on a life of its own. And I think one of the things I realized was that it was really my agenda that I was bringing in. It wasn't the agenda of people actually living in post-conflict communities, and so it wasn't really addressing what they were concerned about or offering a place where people could talk about the things that were of concern to them. So I guess when I became familiar with the transformative model, I realized that rather than me building peace, I should really be there to support people, to listen to them, and to find out what they needed to be able to move forward in the way that they thought was best. And that involved a lot more listening and a lot more support for people to make their own kinds of decisions.
Mm-hmm. My experience is parallel, and it's more in the context of community conflicts in the U.S. And I think of one example where I had been working with a group that was trying to decide on the siting of an incinerator. And there were many community people involved. It was a long process. So we'd been meeting for months and gathering information and talking about the information. And I had planned this activity for the next session that was really going to have people break up into small groups and do some analysis of the data that had been gathered and come back to the large group with the different conclusions that the small groups came up with. And I thought it was a great idea, efficient way to get the information out and really move the group forward. And I remember getting to that meeting and putting it out there and saying, here's what we're going to do. And they kind of looked at me, and then one of them said, we don't want to do that. We think it's really important for us to hear what everybody says, and we don't want to break up into small groups. And it was a real aha moment for me. I thought, well, wait a minute. They know what they need better than I know what they need. So I think and that was one example of many experiences I had where a group would say to me, no, we want to figure this out in our own way. So kind of like what you were saying, Erik. The group was saying to me that this isn't working for us. Mm-hmm. And I also had knew about and had transitioned my interpersonal mediation practice to transformative. And I thought, well, what about taking those principles and applying them to intervention in group and community situations?
Mm-hmm. So for both of you, the work was more about you, it sounded like, in a method that you were bringing. And transformative dialogue is a contrast to that. So in what ways is it a contrast? How close is it to what we call transformative mediation, for example?
Well, there's two things that characterize transformative dialogue. On the one hand, the way that we view conflict, and secondly, also the value of allowing parties to make their own decisions. So the way we view conflict in transformative mediation or dialogue is seeing it as a relational thing where it's the conflict interaction that's important, not necessarily trying to find solutions or to look at underlying needs and interests. but looking at how people conduct their conflict interaction. But secondly, it's also important that as we work with that, we're also allowing people themselves to make decisions both about who they want to talk to, how they want to hold conversations, and what kind of process they want to follow, so that at every stage of the way, when there are decisions to be made, we're not making those decisions for people, but we're helping them to get clear so they can make their own decisions.
Yeah, I would agree. It is, you know, in mediation we talk a lot about following people, and we're following people in transformative dialogue as well. And rather than having a lot of goals that are focused on outcome, that are focused on, as you said before, peace building or getting an agreement, agreements happen. That's important, and that's fine, and people want to get agreements sometimes, or they want to figure out how to have better relations, but we're focused on changing the quality of the conflict interaction. And we feel like if we can help people listen to each other and think about their own perspective on the situation, get clearer and a better sense of what's going on for them, then there's the potential, often realize that they're more open to the perspective of others. And as those shifts happen, people are in a good position to make the best decisions they can, given the situation they face and given their understanding of their own perspective and what others think. So it's really focused on helping people change that conflict interaction. And as that happens on an individual level, it happens on an interpersonal level, it happens on a community level.
Now, in dialogue situations, it's a lot more complicated because it's groups usually, and could be a lot of people involved, kind of amorphous in terms of who could even be involved. So what are some of the process ways that you handle that with transformative dialogue when you're trying to reach out to a larger group of people to decide, you know, things about the nature of their interaction and trying to improve it?
Well, one of the things I think is important is that as we enter a community where we might want to work, we're not bringing with us a preconceived idea of what the conflict is about, or even who is involved in the conflict, who the sides are. I think a lot of NGOs doing work in post-conflict settings have kind of predetermined that, you know, there's two sides to the conflict, and one side thinks this, and the other side thinks this, and here's a map of some of the issues. And we acknowledge that those things can be very multifaceted and very complex, and they can change as time goes on. So one group, one ethnic group may in fact actually consist of all kinds of people with very differing opinions, very different approaches to the setting that they're in.
Within the ethnic group itself.
Within the ethnic group itself. And so we don't make any judgments about that ahead of time. In fact, we just meet people with an openness to allow them to figure out what that looks like. And that might change as the dialogue process goes on. Some people might be meeting within an ethnic group, and then at a later point might want to bring other people from that same ethnic group in, and that yet later even meet with people from another ethnic group, or not.
So you don't go in with an assumption that it's going to be between ethnic groups. There might even be conversations that are occurring that have to happen within ethnic groups,
Right.
and you determine that by where the parties are when you come in.
Right.
Yeah, and we determine that a lot by listening. So I think it's interesting, even in big community conflicts, you still begin by interacting with individuals. So you're sitting down and talking with someone, having a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, and getting a sense of what's going on for them. And who are they talking to and who are they not talking to? And so there's an organic way in which the process evolves from those interactions. So rather than coming in with a plan on week 1 I do this, week 2 I do this, I'm meeting with people, I'm listening to what they're saying, and meetings develop as people are ready for them.
And I think what you were mentioning earlier, some of my earlier work, I think I was, because I had such clear set ideas about what it was I was trying to do, I think I was kind of already defining out a lot of possibilities that I wasn't allowing to happen. So, you know, for example, the idea that you have to have equal numbers of each ethnic group present at a dialogue seminar already excludes a number of conversations from happening. Or that certain people get defined as hardliners or spoilers. Those are words that are in current use in post-conflict settings, and by defining people that way, you've already made not just a decision not to include them, you've actually made a judgment on them that their opinion is not valued and not important. And I think by excluding people like that, you're actually not getting at the heart of the conflict, and you're not talking about the things that are actually necessary to talk about in order to transform conflict.
Right. Yeah, we let conflict happen, and that's a similarity with transformative mediation. I think many mediation processes and many dialogue processes are structured to keep conflict out of the room. And instead, we welcome conflict. It's not that we want people to have conflict, but the reality is they're in conflict and they need to be able to say to each other the hard things that they are ready and able to say to each other. So we don't push them to go to hard places, but we also don't stop them from going to hard places. And it often takes time before people are willing to be honest and open with each other. But it's something that we see happen as we let people make decisions about when they're ready to say something, when they're ready to talk about their own experience in an honest way with someone who they consider to be their adversary. That's an important decision, and that's a decision that we respect.
So most dialogue processes would be interested in developing better conflict interaction between people. What makes this more unique in terms of the quality of conflict interaction that you're seeking when you're doing transformative dialogue?
Well, I think what's unique is that we acknowledge that conflict can be transformed even when people decide to not have frequent interaction. So we don't just define success as being reconciliation, where people, for example, decide we're now going to be friends, we're now going to interact frequently. We don't even necessarily define integration, ethnic or racial integration as a success. What's important is that people themselves come to that decision and make that decision themselves. Sometimes people can decide to have very infrequent interaction and communication. For example, two people who've gotten divorced, but they can still have a positive communication. So they may make the decision that we can't be friends anymore, but we're also not going to fight. We're also going to have a positive interaction when we do need to communicate. And so that's an example of how transformation can happen without frequent interaction, but where it's still positive and constructive, and that's what we're looking for.
Also, you were talking before, Erik, at the beginning about how you used to bring people together and they would do things when you were there, having them do them, and then when you left, nothing would change. And I think another difference is because we let people move at their own pace, because we let people decide what they're willing to do, who they want to talk to, when they're ready to have those conversations, the steps that they make hold in a different way. I believe they're more sustainable because they're really a result of people's own willingness to move. We're not pushing them. And in the same way, we try to work, I think, with local networks and institutions, so we don't come in and bring random people together. We don't come in with the intention of bringing anyone together. We come in and we start talking and listening to people. And who are they connected to? Who do they want to be talking with? Who are they concerned about talking to? So we're talking to lots of individuals, but then when people come together, and they don't always, but they often do choose to come together, there's either a local institution or a network that pre-existed that will exist after we leave. And I think that also helps to build sustainability rather than bringing random people together.
So as a process that's very party-driven as opposed to intervener-driven,
Absolutely.
I would imagine that training this can be challenging for people when you've trained people, if they're very used to a model that is much more structured from the point of view of what the third party is going to do and how the process is going to unfold and who the people are that are going to be involved. Now, you've done this training several times now with interveners who've worked from other models. What have been the biggest challenges, and how do you overcome those in the training?
I think one of the things, and we talk about this openly, is that you have to let go of a lot of ego to do this work. So this notion that I'm coming in to bring peace to this community, or I'm coming in to get an agreement in this tough situation that this community is in conflict about, our role is much more one of support and background. So what that means is that you have to let go of a lot of your own investment in making something happen. But it's interesting because some of the people we trained in Nairobi, a couple of them said to us, it's scary to think about letting go, but it's also freeing. It's so wonderful to think about not carrying that burden. And it is a kind of burden, and carrying that burden distracts you from other things. So when people are able to let go of that need to make things happen, they can be present with people in a different way, and in a way that's very useful. So that's one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think it's also hard to let go of the goal that you're working for peace. I mean, because peace is a positive thing. There's no way you can define that as anything negative. And so, of course, working for peace is a good thing, right? And so it's hard to let go of that and to realize that by having that as your goal, as long as you're a third-party intervener, you may actually be undermining the kind of transformation that needs to take place for peace to actually come. So that was very hard for me. I struggled with that for a long time because I thought, well, I'm dedicated to peace. This is what I'm doing. But I'm now realizing that's of course something I hope for, but it's not something that I have as a goal for my intervention.
Well, the parallel with transformative mediation seems pretty clear because mediators experience the same thing with letting go of an agreement as the focus. Not that agreements don't happen, but that's not the focus of the mediator. And one of the things in transformative mediation that helps mediators let go of that is to substitute other skills. Do you teach people skills at the level of communication and how they interact with people that helps them stay following rather than leading parties or having a specific goal of reconciliation, for example?
Oh yes, we teach many skills, and we teach many of the same skills that mediators use. Those are the same skills we actually use if we're directly involved in conflict. So we do a lot of skill training. And again, another comment that one of our trainees made that I really appreciated was, she realized after the training, she said, I realize now that I've not really been listening to people. At least I've not been deeply listening. And she said, I realize people have been saying really important things that I haven't been hearing because I've been busy thinking about something else. So I think we very much ground people in those skills, and also in an understanding that people have the capacity to do this, and that people need to do it when they're ready to do it. You can't make them, you can't make peace happen. I mean, you can stop violence with force, but I don't know that you can use force to create peace. And I think as people really understand that, and many people doing this work do understand it, because I think they're frustrated by the things you were talking about, Erik, the fact that their work doesn't have as much impact as they'd like. And I think they see the potential for this to have greater impact.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that we also acknowledge that transformative dialogue is a lot more than just what happens when you get a group of people into the room. So a lot of times when you read texts on dialogue or mediation, it's very focused on the actual process in the room. And for us, an equally important part of the process is what happens outside of the room as you have one-on-one meetings with people, as you're informing them about what dialogue is and how it might be beneficial to them. Because those one-on-one conversations, if they're also conducted in a transformative way, can really be helpful to people. It gives them a chance to think about their situation and think about where they want to go. And that can be just as important as the interaction with other people in the room. So for us, transformative dialogue is also a much broader process than just the meetings in the room. It's a part of the whole interaction in the community, in one-on-one conversations, maybe in smaller groups of people, and then in large groups as well, of course. And that's also something we teach in our training as being important.
Yeah.
And what about the unpredictability of where this is going to go? When you walk into the situation, you don't know who is going to talk to who or who will want to talk to who. So does it pose practical challenges in terms of how you structure how long a time you have to be someplace, what's going to happen when? You know, there's some constraints usually in terms of programmatic work that interveners have. Are there any ways that you can prepare people to deal with those issues?
Well, I guess I think, first of all, we're not naive about the reality that many NGOs and many individuals have to write applications to get funding, and in those applications they have to set out some specific goals. And that's why one of the things we've done is included some work on how do you monitoring and evaluation in our training. But I think you do need to set up a timeline, what you expect to have happen, but also we have to educate funders that this takes time, and that it's important to have many conversations, and that whether a large group meets or a large group doesn't meet, positive things can happen even from the individual and the one-on-one conversation. So we're educating the people doing the work, we need to educate the people funding the work that there are many possible outcomes that are positive.
But you can't promise how many dialogues are going to happen on the front end, it sounds like. So what can you promise, and what would you document in terms of the outcomes, the value of an intervention with transformative dialogue?
Well, one of the things that characterizes post-conflict societies is that there's an interruption in patterns of interaction and in communication that happens between people in communities. So people from different ethnic groups, for example, may have prior to the violence have had a lot of contact with each other, been neighbors, perhaps gone to the same school, used the same shops. After violence, it's very often that those kinds of interactions get interrupted, communities get more divided. You can't always see these things visibly if you come to visit, but if you talk to people in the communities, you'll realize only certain people are going to certain cafes or visiting certain shops or clinics. So those patterns are there, and that leads to this kind of polarization in the society. And whether or not you have a high number of dialogue seminars or not, the kinds of things that can start to change are those things, the way that people interact, the way that they communicate, who meets, who goes to what kind of social events, for example. And so we're always looking to document those kinds of things. Maybe people are having a different kind of conversation that they had before because suddenly they've been able to speak about things that they weren't able to talk about before. Or, I've been involved in projects where there's been dialogue happening in school settings where children have started playing together because they've now had a venue for interaction with people from groups that they didn't have any contact with before. So these are small things that are indicators of something much deeper happening. And that can happen in the course of one dialogue seminar, or it may take 5 or 6. It may happen just in the course of small meetings and just because of your presence in the community. Those are the things that we're promising. We're not really, the dialogue seminars are not what's important. What's important is the real outcome of those seminars, the difference that those seminars or meetings make. And that has to do with how people interact on a day-to-day basis in their communities.
Right. It's also the stories people tell about themselves and each other. And you see that changing. And one of the things that we do during the training is we talk to people about how to create a kind of baseline and then look for these changes and note these changes. Because you've got to say to funders, here's what we accomplished. And so we want to be able to say, here are the changes that we see as a result of the work we've done. And those changes are in the quality of the interaction. Whether people agree or whether they disagree. You coined that phrase when we were developing the training of communities being polarized and paralyzed. And that's often how they are. And so we have to watch for the markers and note the changes that we see as people move from that state of paralysis and polarization to a place where their interactions are maybe a little bit more fluid, maybe a little bit more frequent. Again, they may not be integrating, they may not be intermarrying, that may not ever happen. Those are individual choices, and what's appropriate in one situation may not be in another.
But aren't there situations where there is a decision to be made by a group, that one of the
yes.
reasons why you're being called in is that something has to be decided, a bridge has to be built, or something else? So you're not saying that it would always be that open-ended. There could be a focus that the parties themselves realize they have.
Absolutely.
Right, and I think, again, one of our strategies there, and much of the work I've done in the U.S. has been those kinds of very explicit, are we going to put in the incinerator here or not? So there's definitely an agreement to be reached, and people are there because they want to reach that agreement. So we as facilitators can be transparent about that. And we remind people that that's what they're here to do. And if they say, well, we don't want to do that, we want to do something else, well, maybe there's a way we can make that happen too. But I think one of the things we have to be is open and honest about the agenda, and also open and honest about any boundaries that are externally imposed. So I, as a facilitator, might not impose boundaries, but somebody else might. And that's shared, and that's, so I think the transparency there is an important piece.
Well, and you've talked about choice, and Judy mentioned it now too, and I think the measure of success is not so much whether people have fully reconciled or whether they have frequent interaction, but whether the frequency of their interaction is something they've chosen themselves. Do you have a choice, right? Or are you simply being separated because there are sanctions to meeting and having contact? In a lot of post-conflict settings, even people from your own group may punish you if you try to seek contact with people from the so-called other side. But if you're not having that contact, not because you're being sanctioned, but because you're choosing that freely, that's a very different quality of choice than if you are being forced.
Again, party-driven is sort of the essence of this.
Exactly.
Yeah. And to go back to the other possibility, if it's a sort of more of an agreement-driven process, if it's a decision that a community needs to make, that decision gets made, and then how does that leave the community? Are they more polarized after the decision? Is it, majority and there's an angry and upset minority? Or have people worked together to come to a place where whether the whether what happens is exactly what they wanted or not, they're at a place where their interactions and their relations within the community are positive.
Great. Anything else either one of you want to add to an understanding of this approach?
I guess one thing I want to say is it is deeply different. And it doesn't always sound so different. When you talk to people about it, a lot of people often say, oh, I do this. Yes, this is like what I do. But our experience both doing it and training people to do it is that people really see and feel the difference. They know it's not like what they're already doing, and that's what they tell us. They say, this is really different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add, I think it's very satisfying to work from this perspective because it's so based on a really fundamental respect for the people that you're working with. So rather than seeing them as people who are in need of somehow being helped or rescued, and I'm the person coming and rescuing or bringing peace, they know best, and I'm actually respecting that. And that also means that I'm developing a whole different quality of relationship with the people that I'm working with. And ultimately, that's far more satisfying than trying to be the person who's somehow going to bring peace, which is really a kind of crazy idea.
Great. Well, it's great that the two of you have been taking the lead on developing this model and implementing it. It's a wonderful extension of transformative mediation, and thank you both for sharing these ideas today.
Thanks.
Thank you.